It's almost 20 years to the day that Blood Omen Legacy of Kain was released on the PlayStation 1, bringing mature, dark fantasy storytelling to the PlayStation at a time when colourful action platformers were the norm. The game spawned a successful series. The Legacy of Kain resonated with gamers for its intense horror themes and its gothic atmosphere. But the series was plagued with IP changing hands, lawsuits, and internal struggles. By the time of its last title, the industry had begun to recognise the strength of the mega franchise, and so niche titles, no matter how acclaimed, became anathema to big gaming. The Legacy of Kain went from releasing a game nearly every year to nothing in over a decade. The rights to Soul Reaver and the Legacy of Kain are currently held by Square Enix, who know their onions when it comes to revitalising a franchise. If there was ever a time to resurrect Kain, it's now. Every game in the Legacy of Kain series has attracted high critical acclaim. Each individual game holds top marks on game rankings and Metacritic. Soul Reaver specifically holds a 91% on Metacritic, putting it in the top 20 PS1 games ever, above Tekken 2, Siphon Filter, Final Fantasy VIII, and Resident Evil 2. Soul Reaver sold at least 1.5 million units in its heyday, which means it shifted more copies than Shenmue, GTA 2, and Tekken. Blood Omen developer Silicon Knights, they claimed that Blood Omen sold 2 million copies over its lifetime, and the then publisher Crystal Dynamics echoed this, adding that sales for the Legacy of Kain was immensely successful. Despite a cracking start, the series never got to 1 million sales again. Not only did the franchise have to make that shaky jump to a new console, but we now know that there was more at play behind the scenes of Soul Reaver's development. Before we go into that story, I would just like to take a look at what the series excelled at, and maybe therein we can find a way for this series to live again. When the PlayStation 1 launched in 1995, the majority of its games were pretty dodgy. Clumsy 3D graphics and primitive arcade gameplay featured heavily. 3D platformers would follow in the coming year, and games with a central driving story even later. The Legacy of Kain series is held in high regard for its story, which sweeps over 5 games. The story revolves around the vampire Kain, his 1,000-year war against the people of Nosgoth, and ultimately against destiny itself. Soul Reaver introduces the new protagonist, Raziel, with Kain now becoming the villain in a cosmic game of cat and mouse. Intense and complex, even for fans of science fiction or fantasy. The storyline weaves together the concepts of time, destiny, free will, the nature of good and evil, but it never falls into the trap of becoming self-indulgent or condescending. That story is brought to life by terrific voice acting. Michael Bell and Simon Templeman's performances are out of this world, and supporting cast members Anna Gunn and the extraordinary Tony Jay, they take the game to a whole new level, particularly for 1999. Voice acting of this volume or this quality was just not the done thing in those days. Now nowadays, it's commonplace to see Gary Oldman or Kevin Spacey or Sir Patrick Stewart in a video game, but in 1999, even short bursts of dialogue was massively expensive and a tremendously risky move. Before Blood Omen's voiceover was recorded, Silicon Knights president Dennis Dyack was worried that the game's complex dialogue would be too much for the voice actors. Dyack later remarked that the performances blew him away, and he added that after 5 minutes with Simon Templeman, we knew that there was no problem. Now, as I previously mentioned, each game has a pretty good story by itself, but it's that entire series that is outstanding in that one connected whole. To be able to say that about any franchise is a triumph, but for a video game series that was born the same year as Bubsy 3D, the ambition is incredible. Video games were not as narrative-driven back then as they are now, and since Blood Omen we've seen very few attempts at something similar. The titular Legacy of Kain is thousands of years long. It's almost like Hyrule and The Legend of Zelda. There's potential to continue telling so many different stories all throughout this timeline. Actually, on the subject of Zelda, Soul Reaver moved on from its 2D roots to adopt that free-roaming design of the emerging 3D platformer, taking the design ideals of level construction and player exploration, but applying their own creative spin to it. Platforming, combat, puzzle solving, they still make up the heart of the gameplay in Soul Reaver, but they don't feel like they're lifted out of a kid's game. The gothic architecture with its ancient stone pillars and its crumbling strongholds, they demarcate Soul Reaver from that crowd of colourful platformers. Nosgoth feels real, it has a history, and it's as much a character as Kain or Raziel. Soul Reaver pushed the limits of the PlayStation 1 in order to deliver not just a strong contender for the 3D platform game, but to generate a world rich with detail. Raziel's ability to shift between the physical and material realms gave the series a unique core gameplay loop. The differences between these two realms becomes part of the puzzle-solving experience, parts of the game only becoming accessible after shifting between those realms. Crystal Dynamics began developing Soul Reaver utilizing their own cutting-edge technical developments, morphing the environment in real time, streaming data directly from the CD, which basically removed loading times altogether. Soul Reaver pioneered 3D exploration, combat and puzzle solving alongside horror themes and an intense narrative. But in order to concentrate on the storytelling, Soul Reaver 2 and Blood Omen 2 stopped innovating that core loop. Puzzles remained largely the same, the open world was replaced with a more linear structure. By the time Legacy of Kain Defiance launched in 2003, the market had exceeded the Legacy of Kain in all regards. Amy Hennig went on to work at Naughty Dog, taking what she had learned and applying it to the Uncharted series. The Legacy of Kain was shelved, and Crystal Dynamics were charged with taking care of Eidos's Tomb Raider franchise, ultimately leading to the fantastic soft reboot in 2013 under Square Enix. Long-running titles like The Legend of Zelda and Final Fantasy have jumped generations successfully for decades by keeping pace with the changing market. These games are linked by a much larger overarching story and the commonality of that world building without leaning too heavily on one another. A few aborted attempts to resurrect the franchise may have dented Square Enix's confidence in the brand, but titles like Darksiders or Castlevania Lords of Shadow, they all owe a small debt to Soul Reaver. And they've proved there's a lucrative market for modern horror-themed platformers. Crystal Dynamics have been showing us for years that they still have love for Soul Reaver, and we know they're good at bringing a franchise back from the dead. At this, the 20th anniversary of Blood Omen, the market is ready for fresh blood. Horror games are again rather popular, and I would relish another trip to the world of Nosgoth. Thanks for watching. For more gaming videos, please subscribe to The Game Show.